All right, welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fanon, and in this video, we're going to talk about something that Jeff Mayweather said, the uncle of Floyd Mayweather Jr., when he was asked about Errol Spence Jr., Terence Crawford, and then was asked about Terence Crawford versus the TBE, his nephew, Floyd Mayweather Jr. Let's talk about that in this video. Welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fanon. We're going to talk about the current welterweight division, and I guess it's considered historical welterweight division now that Floyd Mayweather Jr. is no longer actively involved in fights. But there was an interview that is up on Fight Hype, Fight Hype's network. You can go check it out over there. And it was an interview where Jeff Mayweather, who is the uncle of Floyd Mayweather Jr., was asked about the outcome, what he believed the outcome would be of Terence Crawford versus Errol Spence Jr. And then that conversation leaked over into a conversation about Terence Crawford and Floyd Mayweather Jr. And I'm telling you, man, it was a very interesting answer from Jeff Mayweather. Before I get into that, though, first, let me say, welcome to the channel. Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button, like button, all of that good stuff. Share the video. If you're not subscribed, hit the bell icon so you can be notified of when we release more videos. But here we go. All right, so Jeff Mayweather, who was the uncle of Floyd Mayweather Jr., the brother of Roger Mayweather, rest in peace, and the brother of Floyd Mayweather Sr., who was the father of Floyd Mayweather, Floyd Mayweather Jr., and who has been a trainer of Floyd Mayweather Jr. during different periods of his life, obviously knows Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s game and his accomplishments and how good a fighter he is, as well as anybody else does, was asked about Terence Crawford, Floyd Mayweather Jr., Terence Crawford versus Errol Spence. And he answered the question believing that he would favor Terence Crawford in the fight over Errol Spence Jr., but then was asked whether or not he believed that how Terence Crawford would do with Floyd Mayweather Jr. Now, the reason he was asked the question was because he said, Terence Crawford has got a really, he can basically do anything in the ring. He's got all kind of weapons, was a great fighter and all this and that, right? All of which I do believe is true. And then he was asked about Floyd, and he said, look, Floyd should pretty much, he insinuated that Floyd, without answering the question too clearly, that Floyd should win the fight, but was very clear in saying, but look, don't get me wrong, that's not going to be, Terence Crawford is no easy fight for Floyd Mayweather Jr., right? So he pretty much laid out that Terence Crawford, even if Floyd Mayweather Jr. is his prime, is such a good fighter that he would actually give a lot of difficulty and may have, and this is me reading into it, may have the potential to beat Floyd Mayweather Jr. when Floyd Mayweather Jr. was in his prime. Now, honestly, I think that's a little bit of a misnomer talking about Floyd Mayweather Jr. in his prime and Terence Crawford in the same breath, because Terence Crawford, I do believe, is really a welterweight, somebody that, is a bigger guy than Floyd Mayweather. And I think the best of Terence Crawford probably is at the 140, 130, 147 pound range, where Floyd Mayweather Jr., I think the absolute best in the prime of him was at 130 and 135 pounds, right? So I just think when we talk about the prime of them, I think it's a little bit, it's a little bit off. I think that Terence Crawford is naturally a bigger guy and the closer thing to a natural welterweight. But that is a lot of praise being heaped on by Jeff Mayweather. And I think it's something that people might want to really take seriously. Like, in my opinion, I would say that I think that if you had Floyd Mayweather Jr. and Terence Crawford and they were both at welterweight at the same time, I think that that would be the hardest fight that Floyd Mayweather Jr. probably has in his entire career. Now, because I've never seen Floyd Mayweather Jr. lose, and I got a lot of respect for him, I might give him the edge to the fight over Terence Crawford just because he's so much more fun. He's not so much more. He's very, very fundamentally sound. He's a very, very smart fighter. But there's a lot of things about Terence Crawford that can cause Floyd Mayweather Jr. a world of trouble. If you look at, like, for example, one of the fights that I look at, if I would, when you try to project those type of things, is I would say, look at, like, consider Terence Crawford to be like, Zab Judah 3.0. I wouldn't say 2.0. I would say Zab Judah 3.0. A guy that's fighting in southpaw, somebody that who's got power in both hands, somebody that is, can be an aggressive fighter, and somebody that is a very, very good counterpuncher. But I just think Terence Crawford is a better fighter than Zab Judah. He's bigger, stronger, and I think that he would cause, I think he would be a significantly more difficult matchup than for Floyd Mayweather Jr. than Zab Judah was. Or if you look at, like, maybe, the fight with Oscar De La Hoya, I think that Terence Crawford is probably a better fighter than Oscar De La Hoya was at 147. So, I mean, I'm one of these guys, man, I'll give credit where credit is due. If you look at it, and I like to look at fights from a stylistic standpoint, because, styles make fights. Fighters don't make fights, styles make fights. So where I believe that Errol Spence Jr. stylistically is a very, very difficult match for Terence Crawford, and quiet as kept, Errol Spence Jr. would be a very, very difficult stylistic matchup for Floyd Mayweather Jr. if Floyd Mayweather Jr. is at welterweight because of the consistency and the work rate that he has. I think Terence Crawford's counterpunching and his instinctual, just natural fighting talent and power would cause a lot of problems with Floyd Mayweather. And also, at welterweight, Floyd Mayweather Jr. is not a knockout artist. So, but he does have enough power to keep people off of him. But I would be interested to see if Terence Crawford took the approach of trying to win rounds with Floyd Mayweather Jr. That I say he may actually have the ability to pull it off, man. But this is not some scenario where I'm saying, yeah, if you put him up there, I would pick Terence Crawford over Floyd Mayweather. But I think it's close enough that if they actually got into the ring together, that a fight could go the wrong way for Floyd. And just say if they fought 10 times, Floyd Mayweather Jr. may win 6, Terence Crawford may win 4, man. But Terence Crawford, just to have that hesitancy in the answer from Jeff Mayweather is a lot of respect to Terence Crawford. And also, this is not unusual if you really listen carefully to Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s family, specifically like Floyd Mayweather Sr., when he was asked by somebody about what he thought Floyd Mayweather Jr. would do with a fighter like Sugar Ray Robinson. He was, again, never going to say that the guy, Floyd can't beat somebody. But when you look at the expression on his face and how non-committal he is in the answer, you know that he takes that as a serious threat, man. And, I'm not one of these guys, and I don't think that anybody should be, that just necessarily just labels a guy the greatest ever and thinks that he has nobody out there that could cause him problems. But that was just really, really interesting, and a lot of credit to Terence Crawford. Obviously, for Jeff Mayweather to answer the question like that, he thinks the world of the dude. And anyway, but my hat goes off to him. That's what I think. You let me know what you think in the comment section. And with that, I'm out. Peace.